Sorry, we just got to make sure that we give our program a minute to warm up there sometimes. So this morning, I've mentioned a few times to those of you who are regulars with us, you've heard a few of my stories. Some of you might be getting sick of me. Sorry, not going anywhere for a while. But I've mentioned a few times that when I was growing up, my family built a house together when I was in my mid-teens. Now, the project took the better part of a year from breaking ground to lockup. That doesn't mean completion. We are that family who has a house that is livable, but perpetually unfinished. Going home for any event is an exercise in absolute torture for me because I see the things that need to be done, and I just don't want to do them. And I wish that my dad finished the window trimmings, just little things like that. Things that are just irritating. It's you can live in it. It's technically weatherproof, but it's not done. But they've lived in it for the better part of 17 years now. So who am I to judge? Now I know that it sounds like a long time for an entire year for a house building project. For some people, that's a very long time to get it up, and you're right, because like I said, it's been 17 years and it's still not finished. That was a lot funnier than you thought it was. Nothing, eh? Oh man, the cold. The cold. In any case, I'm going to stop trying now. So this house, the reason that it took so long is because it's not a typical construction. I was going to look for some good pictures of it, but unfortunately, I'm a guy. I don't take pictures of anything. So I was going to try and show some pictures of it, but the thing you need to understand about this house is the reason that it took so long to finish is because it's not a typical project. This is a house that doesn't have the typical framing. It's a house that is built almost entirely out of concrete and structural steel and glass, because apparently my dad just can't be happy with normal stuff. Now, this was a massive undertaking for us because we did, like I said, we built it ourselves. And I was reminiscing with him this week. I was talking with him on the phone, and I was reminiscing about the project with him. And he admitted to me that the ambition of the project, how much because he designed this thing. We shot the elevations. He actually is an architectural draftsman. He designed this entire thing. This is the house that he'd had in his head since he was 18. He designed the whole thing, and there were almost no compromises on the design. And he said that the ambition of the project was almost overwhelming and that the pace of the work was almost too much. He wondered towards the end whether or not he would actually be able to finish. But we also talked about how in the middle of the work, sometimes we would come out at night. We would go out to the construction site. We were living just a few hundred meters away from there on the property. We would come out onto the construction site, and we would go out in the middle of the night, and in the middle of the mess, in the middle of the unfinished things, we would stand in these areas, and we would take time to imagine what it would be finally like to live in that space when it was finally finished. The work still needed to be done. And it was an exhausting pace, and everything seemed to be a priority. It didn't matter who was coming in, they were the most important. But the thing that got us through to the end was the promise that something worthwhile was waiting for us when the whole project was over. And we still tell ourselves that. Our passage for today comes from Matthew 22. We're going into verses 31 and 32. We're sort of orbiting around those two verses today. If you have a Bible with you, I'll invite you to start opening your way up to there. Matthew chapter 22, verses 31 and 32. Now, as we've been making our way through this long series in Matthew this year, started last December, we're still going through it. As we've been making our way through the book of Matthew together, it's become pretty obvious that the story and the content has been steadily getting more and more intense as Jesus and his disciples approach Jerusalem and the day of his crucifixion. We've also seen the way that people who opposed Jesus had started to escalate their efforts. They escalated their campaign to either discredit or trap him in something. And all through this, the challenge from Jesus to his followers has been getting more and more urgent and intense meaning that the messages for the past few weeks have been getting more urgent and intense, and there have been many times where I've invited you at the end to open yourself up to examine yourself. It's a lot. It's been getting very intense. I get it. It's a lot. I've been feeling it too. I've been feeling it as I've been studying and wrestling with these passages. So I do think that it's good on a regular basis to present ourselves before God for examination, to ask Him whether there's anything in us that needs to change, to become more and more like Him, that we can be continually conformed more to the image of Jesus day by day. It is not a process that is ever finished on this side of heaven. I think it's good to go before God and present ourselves on a regular basis. But that being said, if you don't take time to rest and remind yourself of what you're looking forward to, then things can feel very heavy and it can get very exhausting. So today what I want to do is I want to take a look, as we're continuing our walk through Matthew today, I want to try and intentionally take a step back from the intensity as it's building up around the story. I want to take a moment to step back and regroup and be encouraged by what we're looking forward to as followers of Jesus. So with that in mind, I want to read Matthew 23, verses 31 and 32, and I'm going to be reading from the NIV today. Matthew 22, verses 31 and 32. About the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the living. I promise you, this does get encouraging. Here's what I want to focus on from this passage. Followers of Jesus can faithfully work for the advancement of God's kingdom no matter the circumstances, because Jesus gives us hope for eternity. Now, for anyone who has or is experiencing heartache, loss, disappointments, or setbacks while faithfully following God, it can be more than discouraging. It can actually be heart-wrenching and confusing, devastating. The good news from the gospel is that this life is not the end, though. Jesus gives us eternity with Him to look forward to, no matter what life has put us through. Jesus gives us hope for today. Jesus gives us hope for now and beyond now. Now, as we go into this, I want to make sure that we're not taking it out of context. I want to give you a little bit more of what's going on in the story. So we're going to go back just before, and we're going to set the scene a little bit together. So what's been happening here is that Jesus is yet again teaching His followers in a public setting. He's got huge crowds of people around Him. Again, it's not just Him and the disciples anymore. For the last few weeks, it's been a pretty intimate crew around Jesus. We saw last week in chapter 21 that He and the disciples had arrived in Jerusalem together, and Jerusalem meant crowds, lots of people, big city. Jerusalem contained the temple, the central point of worship in all of Judaism. A site of pilgrimage for the Jewish people. We also know from the story that Passover was approaching, and if you're not familiar with what Passover is, it's actually a celebration of what happened to the Israelites in the book of Exodus when God delivered them from the Egyptians. The final judgment over the Egyptians, the death of the firstborn, but the Israelites were spared from it. Punishment for sin came into Egypt, but those who followed God were spared. So we know that in this story that Passover was approaching, and that meant that the city would be even more crowded than usual. So as Jesus was teaching in the temple, He would come into the temple as a rabbi, and He would be teaching in the temple of Jerusalem. And as He was teaching, enormous crowds would be gathering around to hear Him and to be healed by Him. Everybody knew what Jesus was all about at this point. We've also established that the religious authorities, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, were unhappy with Jesus' teaching. We're going to get into that in a little while. They were unhappy with Jesus' teaching, and so they were actively plotting at this point to have him killed. They just needed a good enough reason to demand his execution. Because Jesus was so immensely popular with the crowds, it would not be smart to move against him without a decent reason. So these religious leaders, they continued doing what they did best. They challenged him with questions designed to make him lose credibility. In front of everybody, we're going to try and ask him a question that he cannot answer without losing credibility. If you go back to verse 23, get an example of this. That same day, the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection, pay attention to that, that becomes very important in the story. That same day, the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. We would think of this as awkward now, but... Now, were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died. Since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and the third brother, right on down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? Now, honestly, if this question was coming from anyone else, it would be a great question. If it was coming from anyone else under any other circumstances, this would be a great question. Jesus, what does the transition to eternity look like? What about the relationships we had on earth? Will I recognize anybody? What's it going to be like when we enter into eternity? Am I going to look like this? Because if so, I don't know if I want to look like this for eternity. Maybe a little off the sides. Those are great questions to ask from a place of sincerity. But it's pretty obvious that this question is coming from a place of hostility. The Sadducees, like it says in the text, they were what you might refer to, like it says in the text, they did not believe in the resurrection at the end of the age. They were what you might refer to as biblical literalists. And I'm not trying to say anything against that. I'm just saying this is who they were. They were biblical literalists. They stuck strictly to what was explicitly taught in the law and gave much less weight to the prophets and the other rabbinic teachings that the Pharisees tended to draw from. They viewed God as a distant creator. If you understand what the concept of deism is, it's the idea of the divine clockmaker who winds the universe up and then steps away to watch it go. They viewed God as a distant creator, and they denied things like the persistence of the soul and rewards or punishments after death. When you see the Sadducees asking this question, it's appropriate in the text to actually hear it as derisive or snide or insulting or even a little bit sarcastic. Hey, wise teacher, if a woman goes through 7 husbands in life, what's the reunion going to be like in heaven for her? It's a question that not only shows their cynical intent, it also tells us about what they put their hope in. Here's another thing to know about the Sadducees. It helps sort of give a little bit more context to this story. When the Romans came into Israel and Judah, when they came in and they conquered the region, the Sadducees, who were religious aristocracy, they threw their support behind the new occupiers. They partnered with the Romans, not because they believed it was the right thing to do, but because they could gain power by supporting them. The Sadducees, in reality, when we think of them, when we look in the Bible, sometimes we can get this impression that they are this big, powerful sect of Judaism. But in reality, They were a minority in the temple. They were a minority sect. But they still held high positions of authority. The high priests at the temple in Jerusalem were typically Sadducees. And by and large, the Sadducees were aristocratic with a lot of wealth and influence to throw around. Powerful old families. And you can see this kind of pattern develop in pretty much any kind of organization over time. The powerful see an opportunity to secure more power, and they pursue it. And this is what the Sadducees did. For the Sadducees, though, you could argue that this was also a reflection of their theology. This didn't just reflect their political acuteness or their abilities politically, but it also reflected their theology. If God is uninvolved and uninterested in earthly affairs, and if there's no life after death, then what else is there to live for? Why should we care about anything else other than securing our power? For the Sadducees, the law of Moses presented and represented a path to power and authority. Here's this thing that everybody looks to, and we're going to make sure that we emphasize it, that we keep to it very literally, because this is our path to power. Jesus represented a threat to that power. Not just because he was gaining a following and taking away from their following, but because he taught that this life is not all that there is. He taught that God is intimately involved in how his followers live, and that his eternal kingdom belonged to people dedicated to humbly serving God and others. Back to verse 29. Jesus replied to them, "You're in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven." You've probably heard the idiom that there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, it turns out that may not necessarily be universally true. Jesus answers the Sadducees by essentially saying, that's a dumb question. You wouldn't be asking that question if you actually knew what you were talking about. You're asking either from a place of ignorance, or you're asking from a place of hostility. You would not be asking that question if you knew what you were talking about. Now, as we've been walking through Matthew, we've been hearing the way that Jesus has preached that the kingdom of heaven was a present reality wherever he went. It was a present reality wherever he and his followers went. Now, Jesus brought God's kingdom by healing the sick, feeding the hungry, calling people to turn away from their sin and commit themselves to God. And ultimately, he would make reconciliation. He would bring the kingdom here and now, ultimately by making it possible for reconciliation between sinful people and a holy God possible through his death and resurrection. The kingdom Jesus preached was near to anyone he came in contact with. However, that present kingdom was always given as a foretaste. It was always given as a foretaste of what was to come. It was a teaser or a preview of what the kingdom would be like when it came in all of its fullness. Jesus brought hope for now by giving a glimpse of what is waiting for us in eternity. Here's the short answer to the Sadducees' question about that awkward reunion in eternity. Marriage now is an image of the kind of intimacy that humanity was created to live in. Ideally, in a marriage, two become one in a way that goes beyond physical union. They form a family where everything is shared equally and where husband and wife serve one another faithfully. Serve one another in love. In God's eternal kingdom, everyone will live in perfect unity. Unlike here on earth, there will be no barriers between people. Nothing that stops us from knowing one another fully. God will impart His holiness on us so that we can live and serve Him and one another in sinless and unhindered love for eternity. There's no possession of a wife or a husband in heaven. There is only unity in God's Spirit. Your question is invalid. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that God said to you, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He's not the God of the dead, He's the God of the living. In the beginning, there's a movie that my wife and I really love to watch every once in a while. It's a movie called Gladiator. Now, in the beginning of the movie Gladiator, a Roman army commander named Maximus is getting his troops ready to enter a battle with a group of barbarian forces that are sort of the last remnant of Germanic resistance north of Rome. Now, if the battle is won, it'll mean total dominion of the continent. And by extension, it will also usher in a time of peace at the end of a long and hard campaign. Now, Maximus rides out in front of his troops and gives a speech to steel their resolve, and he ends by telling them this: what we do in life echoes in eternity. In other words, even if you die in the battle here today, your bravery and service will carry you over into the next life. What you do today affects your soul for eternity. Back to Jesus. In the exact laws that the Sadducees claimed to venerate so highly, the things that they claimed to value so much, Jesus affirms the persistence of the soul. You guys haven't even read your own stuff well enough to know this. Jesus affirms the persistence of the soul. He says that death is not the end, and that what you do in life will echo in eternity. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all men of faith. They were by no means perfect, but we read in Romans 4 that the faith of those who came before Jesus is counted as righteousness. And because of that, their souls persist with God in eternity. They live with God in eternity. They were called home because of their faith. God is not the God of the dead, but the living. Here's what I want to leave you with as we transition into communion together this morning. Now, it's not difficult to fall into the same rut that the Sadducees did. They saw God as distant and uninvolved in the world, and because they believed in that, it affected how they lived, what their values were, what they pursued. It made sense to live for power and wealth and influence because if there's nothing beyond now, then it's imperative to maximize your security now. If there's nothing beyond now, then it's important to exercise justice over people because this is the only time for it. If God is uninterested in what goes on in the world, then we can't count on Him for justice. I've got to distribute justice around here. If there's no hope beyond now, then this life is all there is, and I need to live it for me. It's my only shot at it. Now, here's the problem that I see with that. And this is just me. If this is all that there is, and I do not live the good life, everything about my life has been wasted. I've got no hope for anything. If I can't trust that God's justice will be carried out, then I can't freely forgive others. I can't. And I'll live in bitterness because I need to extract my justice on them. If there's nothing beyond now, then the only thing I have is a weak foundation to hold on to in troubled times because I've got nothing else, just me. Alternatively, here's what Jesus offers: strength for today, bright hope for tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, and on into eternity. Even in the darkest night of the soul, the most heartbreaking loss or the deepest suffering, Jesus gives us eternity with him to look forward to, no matter what this life has put us through. Life with Jesus gives us hope for now and hope beyond now. In a moment, I'm going to call up the communion servers, and as we're handing out the elements, I'm going to invite Jane to come forward, and she's going to be singing a song above all for us. And after that, John's going to lead us in communion. I want to invite you, as you're holding the bread and the cup, to concentrate on what the song is proclaiming. By his eternal nature, Jesus invites his followers to live in the hope of his kingdom that is present now and that will be established perfectly forever. It is by the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus that we are reconciled to God for eternity. As you meditate on that, as you meditate on what is being sung, I invite you to humbly thank God that through Jesus there is hope beyond now. So we get ready to serve communion here. Jack, I'm going to ask you to help me hand some stuff out.